We're very pleased to be joined today by three very thoughtful, strategic thinkers for a conversation on China. We have Charlene Barshevsky, Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, who during her time in government was one of the major architects of the negotiated agreement that led China into the WTO. Steve Hadley is a former national security advisor under President George W. Bush. And Q-Song Lee is the CEO of the Carlyle Group, who will moderate this today's discussion. It promises to be very interesting and provocative, and we look forward to the views that are expressed right now. Q-Song Lee.
Charles, thank you. And let me join you in the chamber in welcoming Steve and Charlene to this hopefully very engaging and I'm sure a very insightful discussion. And let's just get right into it. With all that's going on in the world, Charlene, just help us just take a step back. Where are we with U.S.-China relations from your perspective, and maybe high level, where do you think this is going?
So first of all, thank you so much. Great to be with you, of course, and with Steve, and thank you to the chamber as well. Let me, if I could, make just a couple of general points and then talk a little bit about the economic relationship. Two general points. The first is that China's ascendancy presents a long-term, multidimensional challenge to the US and indeed to many countries in the world. And China's ascendancy is marked by an increasingly contested global order across all dimensions, whether political, economic, technological, space, security, military, so on and so forth. Other countries present threats. There is no other country that is a challenge across all of these domains. And I believe China looks particularly at the United States and sees exactly the same thing, but in the reverse. So China, of course, has been described as a strategic rival, a competitive threat, an enemy, lots of different words. I think it's very difficult to pin one word on the nature of the relationship. I just think that China presents myriad challenges to the United States, to Western democracies and generally, and economically to many countries in the world. Second general point I'd make is that China's governing model is highly statist. The state is at the center. On the economic side, that means state-led development per a strategic plan developed by the state over many, many, many years. And on the political side, you're looking at party-centric political and social control. And I point this out because it has long been said in the West that only democracies, only free countries can drive sustainable growth, only free countries can innovate. And China's view is that its particular model brings both sustainable economic growth and innovation, coupled with political and social order. And that this stands in sharp contrast with the West and is a more desirable model than the Western model. So you have conflicts across all domains, and then you have a conflict in economic models between the two nations. And on the economic side, that conflict is crystallized, and it's crystallized by China's intensive focus on what it calls the technologies of the future economy, the fourth industrial revolution. China is determined to lead in that, having missed the industrial revolution of the 17 and 1800s. And it is in this area of technologies, IP, heavy industries, value-added manufacturing, the future economy, part of which is here today, that is at the heart of the US-China relationship. In terms of where things are going, thinking about Xi Jinping as being in power, of course, we can't say that's forever, but Xi Jinping believes that China's model that its focus on innovation, that its programmatic desire to dominate in industries of the future is the direction of the world. As he says, history is on China's side, the momentum is on China's side. And for the United States, the key and most important factor in the nature of the relationship with China is a strong United States, economically strong, militarily strong. Nothing compensates for that, nothing substitutes for it in this relationship with China.
Okay, Charlene, you set up so many great issues for us. So let me push with one quick follow-up question, then I want to get Steve into the discussion. The way it's been set up, with China's intent on making sure it leads in the digital revolution, with the rivalry that you've described across so many different dimensions, the competition, and quite, obviously the very different form of governance and governing model. Everything in that suggests that there is a zero-sum mentality that is potentially inevitable. And so I guess my question is there a potential for coexistence at all? Or do you think we're slated for continuous confrontation with this zero-sum mindset?
So zero-sum mindsets are highly destructive. Because the zero sum applies in both directions. Mm-hmm. Neither country is so dominant in particular areas that it can believe it is in a position to dominate at this juncture. That creates its own restraint on both countries. See, both countries need time. China needs time to further strengthen itself. It needs time toward its goal of self-sufficiency. The US needs time to strengthen its economy, to strengthen its social fabric. That exercises a kind of restraint in the way zero-sum thinking might. But in terms of the long run, I think the jury is out. One always hopes for peace, for coexistence. There should be, as Xi Jinping has said, every reason for the countries to coexist, no reason for the countries to go to war. But things are rarely so black and white. And so for the longer term, I do worry.
Steve, our former president tried to do much to change the nature of the relationship and in many ways, policies to hold China back. What's Biden's current policy and what's your read of it in the early days of the administration? What's really changed? And what do you think the path forward is with respect to the current president and what we're going to do vis-a-vis China?
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank the Chamber for having this event and giving me a chance to participate with you and with Charlene. I think that there is a belief generally in the United States and within the Biden administration that China has decided that, as they say, the correlation of forces favors China, that Western values are on the decline, and the United States in particular is in decline. They see that in how we've managed COVID in terms of some of our financial problems. And this is really China's moment. And I think many in the administration think we need to change that perception on the part of the Chinese if we are going to be able to have the kind of constructive relationship and get China to change some of the behavior that Charlene has talked about. How do you do that? Well, I think they have sort of three things they want to do. One, they want to craft a bipartisan approach to China, because they think that will send the signal to the Chinese of staying power, that this is something they're going to have to deal with over the long term. And I think they have a good chance of constructing a bipartisan China strategy. Secondly, they want to get our friends and allies bought into that strategy and policy. Alone, we do not have enough weight to change China's behavior, but with our friends and allies, we have an economic and geopolitical weight that might achieve that. And thirdly, there are things we need to do at home to put ourselves in a position to compete effectively, infrastructure, high technology investments, so that China has to understand that if they really want a head-to-head competition, they may lose. Having sort of established that platform of strength, and hopefully can disabuse China of the notion of American decline, they then, I think, are crafting a policy that's sort of a three-track policy. And you heard it in what Secretary Blinken has said. We are going to compete where we should. We are going to cooperate where we can. And we're going to stand up for our principles where, in fact, we must do so in the face of differences that matter with Chinese, particularly over values and the like. And their hope is to pursue those three, in some sense, in parallel. They believe they have to correct for the underplaying of human rights concerns on the part of President Trump. So I think they've kind of overdone a little bit the human rights issue to make the point that human rights are back on our agenda. I think they will find a way to talk to China about human rights in a way that does not derail the rest of the agenda. Secondly, in the area of competition, the trick is going to be to separate our economies in the high-tech areas where we need to, and where China has said that it wants to in order to be greater self-sufficient, but not let that decoupling go across the board. So there still is cross-investment and trade where it makes sense for the two countries. And then finally, areas of cooperation. They've talked about they want to do it. Everybody knows the list: pandemics, climate change, macroeconomic issues, Iran, the like. The real challenge there is to stop talking about cooperation and start doing cooperation, with concrete cooperation on things that are important, that send the message to both of our peoples that there's actually something in it for both peoples if the two countries can cooperate. I think that's what they're going to try to do. Pursue those three tracks at the same time and not let any one track take the other two hostage. The query is whether the Chinese are willing to play within that construct, and can we avoid confrontation over things like Taiwan that might throw the whole thing into a cocktail.
So that's what I was just about to ask you, which is, okay, so you've laid out incredibly well our approach, three-pronged approach. Take us to the other side of the equation, looking at it through President Xi and what's happening in China. What is their perspective on their approach vis-a-vis what you just outlined? Answer your query. Answer the query that you set up.
I think actually the three-prong approach is more explicit now than it has been before. But in fact, under the Clinton administration, or the Bush administration, or the Obama administration, we were always working these three approaches. What's different now? One, on human rights, the Chinese tolerance for being lectured by us on human rights is at an all-time low. And I think what we need to do there is agree that we're going to agree to disagree, to make it clear that neither of us is trying to change the regime of the other. We accept that we can cooperate and we can coexist. But while the Chinese keep talking about American interference in Chinese matter, I tell you, one of the things under the Xi regime is they've been interfering in our political system plenty. And if we're going to go back to that coexistence, they're going to have to knock it off. They're going to have to knock it off. Again, on the competition, much more intense now than it ever has been before. The trick is, can we compete and separate where we feel we must, but bound that competition so that it is a competition where, on a level playing field, they're going to win some, we're going to win some, not a form of competition where you try to put the other side out of business. Can we bound the competition? I think that's the question. And in cooperation, I would just say again, lots of areas of cooperation. I think both sides recognize it. Getting China and the United States to cooperate is really hard. And I think one of the things we have to do is do what we can at the government to government level, but get the governments out of the way and empower the kind of bottom-up cooperation between our businesses, between our universities, between our scientists, that probably is where we will be most effective in the cooperation between the two countries.
More points of constructive engagement. Charlene, you touched on this, but let me ask, implicit in what both of you have said as you've laid this out is kind of the current Xi doctrine and Xi approach. Is Xi and the current approach forever?
So this is a really interesting question. We know, if we look at Europe or the United States, we know that leadership matters. Leadership can be constructive. Leadership can be destructive. One doesn't have to be an autarchical government to see that democracies are affected by leadership as well. And so the question is Xi's brand of leadership something permanent? Has it now been so inculcated into the party that the next leader is bound to continue Xi's policies? Or is there more flexibility there? Is there more fragility there with respect to Xi Jinping's rule, such that at some point, as he steps down, there are changes in China? The one thing I think that Xi has done particularly effectively, though, which I think does put some bounds on a successor, is encapsulating its military and strategic and economic posture in a wrapper. And that wrapper is the China dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. And the way Xi has defined that to encompass, as he says, all forms of China's power. This is further reduced to comprehensive national power, comprehensive national power. And this is an extremely attractive wrapper on the whole of all of these disparate programs. And because there is a kind of determinism about the outcome, China had always been at the center for thousands of years, Its retreat from the center is relatively new, 500-600 years. So this notion that there is a right, it is China's destiny to again be at the center, to be able to fulfill the dream of rejuvenation, and the pieces to do that, which on their face sound completely sensible and rational, right? Strong military, strong economy, accelerated development, technological dominance. All of these things sound completely sensible, and many would argue are completely sensible. These elements are perhaps what's at play around the edges, but the wrapper of the dream, I think, is very powerful. And I think a leader would depart from it to his peril, because it would look as though a new leader were weak. The dream is no longer the dream.
Interesting. You know, I'm curious. Many years ago, the Beijing Olympics represented something quite important for China, and their whole behavior internationally was influenced by the staging of that event. And, you know, Steve, let me go back to something you said, which is things may be different this time. Let's talk about the upcoming Winter Olympics and just what's different this time. And do you think there's going to be as much sensitivity from China with respect to the rest of the world in terms of relations as this event approaches?
In 2008, the last Olympics, the Chinese really, it was China's coming out party. And they didn't want anybody raining on their parade. And they were clearly on their best behavior in the run up to the Olympics. China today is a different China, much more self-confident China. They want things to go well for the upcoming Olympics. But I think their attitude is that they have a lot more leeway in the run up to the Olympics, because China is a different China, and most countries will come and play on China's terms. I think what you're going to see is countries will show up. I don't think there'll be a great boycott, but they may show up at a level or two below the top political level to send a message. And I think businesses are going to be a little bit more cautious in their affiliation with the Olympics. But I think generally it's going to be different this time. And I don't think it'll be a constraint, particularly on Chinese behavior. I want to, if I can, just add to what your conversation with Charlene. It's one thing to say the next leader after Xi Jinping. I think we need to look more broadly than that. Charlene is right. Xi is mobilizing Chinese society with the China dream, and he's keeping control of China's society by saying the United States is trying to oppose our ability to reach the China dream. Therefore, we have to have solidarity at home. But what happens in 2051 when they are a fully developed country and they've reached the China dream? What will be the mindset of that generation? And will it really be comfortable and willing to accept the degree of repression and control that Xi Jinping is exercising now in the name of overcoming resistance to achieving the China dream? I don't think we know. A lot of people say, well, we were too naive. We thought economic reform and opening would lead to political opening. I don't think we drank that Kool-Aid. I thought we had a lot of other good reasons for the China policy we pursued, but I wouldn't count that out yet, that over time, the kind of openness on the economic side won't lead to demands on the political side. I was with a track 2 with Chinese this morning. They said, you don't recognize how much China has evolved over in 40 years. And my answer was, I recognize that, but you need to recognize that China will continue to evolve. And we don't know what it's going to look like 40 years from now.
So with that comment, how do you interpret, Steve, the more recent actions on the tech sector and the tech companies, which have been kind of, among the most amazing things that have happened in Chinese business, and their regulation and some of the strong signals they're sending to those leadership teams within these businesses?
Well, this is Charlene's expertise, so I'm going to defer to her, but I'll just say two things. One, there's a good news and bad news. The interesting news is that China is actually acting out on the tech sector, dealing with some of the concerns that the US Congress and the American people have about our tech sector. China's just getting ahead of us. That's the good news. The bad news is this is a message from Xi Jinping, a la Vladimir Putin and his attitude in the early 21st century with respect to oligopolists and the oil industry. He's basically saying political control trumps everything. And he, I think, believes that these institutions got too big for their britches, got too much economic power. That would translate into political power. And Xi Jinping is not going to brook any competitors for political power. That's the bad news of the crackdown.
Right. A statement about who's really the boss here. Charlene, exactly. This is your area of anything you want to add to what Steve just said?
No, I couldn't have said it better than Steve. The key learning, I think, is that there are no alternative sources of power other than the party. Period, full stop. Even if you are successful, even if you are a world-class company from a country that has trouble building world-class brands, even if you are embedded, you are the emblem of what Xi is trying to achieve across the board with respect to technologies of the future. There are no alternative sources of power, or power centers, I should say, other than the party.
Right.
Period.
All right, let's shift gears now, Charlene. I want to stick with you. In part of your comments, but also Steve elaborated on it, there was an important element of cooperate where we can, and even get our allies to help in this effort as it relates to the evolving relationship that we're still trying to figure out, obviously, between China and the United States. But let me broaden it to the Western world. And so how important is Europe in the evolving nature of this relationship, and what role will they play, and can we really count on them?
So this is the $64,000 question. Certainly, the United States ought to have a plan B on the assumption that working with friends and allies is not easy, that you can be close friends but have significant differences with respect to certain interests that you hold. You're under different pressures, under different politics. Every country has its politics. And so the United States may find, even with the best of intention on the part of all parties, that cooperation falls short of achieving particular goals. I think if you look at Europe, there are sort of 5 reasons they might think of China differently from the United States, or might be less capable of joining the United States effort. I think the first, of course, for Europe is the degree of export dependency on China. Germany is the poster child of that. Second, the disagreements within the EU itself, Northern Europe from Southern Europe, and the relationship of Southern European countries to China, including with respect to Chinese inward investment versus some of the Northern countries. I think third, threat perceptions differ. Europe does not feel at security risk from China. Europe is not positioned in the Pacific the way the United States is. And the result is that Europe does not feel a sense of imminent threat as the United States might feel. Indeed, many Europeans believe even indirectly there is no threat from China. I think fourth, you have Macron and strategic autonomy. Europe wants to embrace strategic autonomy. How could it follow the United States? And last, and perhaps this is a good lesson for the United States to think about, the US may want to retain its status as the sole superpower, or as a superpower, or as unique in the world. Europe is not going to fight with China in order to preserve America's unique role in the world. That's a US interest. It is not an interest Europe would necessarily fight China over. On the other hand, Europe has made clear it is very disturbed by China's behavior on human rights related issues and on values, fundamental values. Of course, that comports with the US view. Public opinion in Europe is as negative on China as it is in the United States. Third, Europe is affected by Chinese mercantilism and these highly distortive trade and economic policies coming out of China. And last, Europe recognizes, as does the US, that unilateral approaches don't work very well. They don't really move China at any fundamental level. And so I think as we look at the European picture, and you think about the constraints they're under, but you think about sort of these general interests that we hold in common, Europe will end up doing a balancing act. And that's in part why the US needs a plan B, because balance implies you don't get everything you want.
Right. So obviously there's an undercurrent of trying to thread the needle there that Europe has, which leads me to the next question, which Steve, I'd like to put to you, but I'm sure the audience members, but also all of us could appreciate your counsel on this. Increasingly in this politicized environment, it feels like US companies and European companies, all companies are being asked to perhaps make a choice. And in the context of issues like Taiwan and human rights, et cetera, what is the best way for companies to try to navigate this, as increasingly it feels like in many instances, people are asked to make a choice? Is it about your values and your country and what you stand for, or about business and making money and commercial efforts? And and it's getting very difficult. So any thoughts you have on this very touchy and tricky issue would be, I'm sure, most appreciated.
I've got some thoughts. I know Charlene as well. Let me just make one comment on the allies point. I agree
Sure.
with everything Charlene said. You know, Americans talk about how we're unique because we have this great global set of alliances that China does not have. And that is a comparative advantage for us. But watch out what China is doing in the developing world. They are building a constituency for themselves in terms of the Belt Road Initiative, in terms of COVID vaccinations and the like. And when they talk about supporting the UN system, what they have in mind is if the United States can stymie them in the Security Council, they will go to the General Assembly and collect chits on all those developing country votes. That's what they mean by their version of the international system is the UN system. We need to be paying attention to that. Look, companies are, you know, between a rock and a hard place, as we say, in terms of doing business in China. China wants to force them to choose, as does the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sort of four ways this gets played out. One, these kind of ideological issues. Do you condemn what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, or are you willing to accept what China's doing in Xinjiang and even accept product out of Xinjiang? Do you support the national security law in Hong Kong, or do you oppose it? These are lose-lose propositions for US companies, and they should not be making statements either in pacts or unilaterally. These are issues where they have to keep their head down, because they will either alienate China or they will alienate the administration, the Congress, and the American people, and their CEOs will be drug up before the Congress to explain why they signed on to the Hong Kong national security law. So on these political things, there's nothing in it for US companies to take a position. Second, there are operational challenges. You see that with Apple's story. I don't know whether it's true or not. Apple supposedly has taken all its data on Chinese citizens, put it in China, put it in a facility that is run by the Chinese government and to which they will have access. This is anathema to what the United States government thinks companies should be doing. So there are enormous operational choices that companies are being asked to make in how they conduct operations in China. And they've got to try to find a way to thread the needle to see if they can be compliant with both Chinese law and American law and sensitivities. Third, they may not be able to thread the needle. And one of the things I think US companies need to do is to monitor the situation, the business environment and political environment in China, have really indicators that will tell them whether things are getting better and getting worse. And they need to have contingency plans that if things really get bad, they can move their people out, they can move their operations out and diversify in the region out of China. They've got to be in a position to do that because the uncertainties are so high. That's my take. Charlene will have her own.
Charlene?
I think Steve and I are in alignment about this. I think one of the most challenging areas for companies, though, are their own employees and employee expectations as to what the company stands for. This is an acute issue with respect to millennials as well as younger people, many of whom are in companies today. And so this issue of how employees feel, how your shareholders feel, how your institutional shareholders feel about issues, what they expect of a company beyond simply making money. This is, I think, the up and coming issue. ESG issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, issues that pertain to human rights in that regard. I think these will become increasingly inescapable for companies. Certainly programmatically, you already see that today on the part of many companies, but also with respect to a company's view as to its responsibilities in a broader world. And so as Steve, I think the single most important thing here is an evaluation of risk. It is to have in place in advance mitigation measures. It is to have extremely sophisticated communication strategies, including social media strategies. And it is to be able to pivot rapidly such that diversification without undue disruption is possible, even if there's a bit of redundancy that has to be built in, even if it means some increases in costs. There is nothing more harmful to a company than reputational risk or a reputational downturn. As you know, it's very hard to regain trust once you've lost it. And so companies have to be prepared in advance in a way that would have been even unthinkable 5 years ago. It's a different world now and will continue to be so.
All right, so we've got, I mean, we've gone all, so many interesting issues we've explored. We've got time for one more question, and I'll start with Charlene, and then Steve, also the same question to you. So taking a step back, as I've listened carefully, it feels like China's not really going to be deterred, at least with its present regime in place, with respect to its aspirations. Feels like there's going to be continued points of rivalry, competition, while all at the same time, we're looking for ways to constructively engage, to figure out where we can cooperate. And it feels like we have two very different systems with different values, with different forms of leadership and government. And the question is really, is there coexistence even possible with the rivalry that has developed or not? And you've given us some thoughts on that. And Charlene, I'm curious, if we tried to end this on an optimistic note, if there was one thing the United States really needed to do, what would that one thing be?
Self-strengthen.
Focus inward, strengthen domestically.
There is, as I said earlier, there is nothing that will compensate for a weak United States. A weak United States and a response that brings in our allies won't get the result you want, because the allies will have no confidence that the United States has their back. A weak United States is a vulnerable looking United States. A weak United States is a United States that can't adequately protect or project US interests abroad. If we look at the behavior of China during the US financial meltdown, we can see that the vacuum created by US leadership because of US weakness, in that case, economic weakness and vulnerability, really gave room, gave space for China and other regimes to come to the fore in a way that was rapid and difficult to address, as we now see. So I think, for my money, a strong United States is everything. It has, in some ways, less to do with China,
Right,
and more to do with our own internal fabric, our own internal security, our own view of our place in the world. None of that is accomplished by a weak country, or certainly not rationally accomplished by a weak country. So my goal is always the US first, in the sense of get your own house in order. That's
Sure.
job 1, 2, and 3. And China will do what it will do. The US is best positioned to respond to whatever China does if it is also strong.
Steve, I started with Charlene, so you get the last word. I'm going to put the same question to you. You're on mute, Steve.
Sorry, there was some background noise here. I agree with Charlene. It starts with the United States fixing itself. If it does so, we have lots of strength in terms of our economy, university system of innovation, a strong younger generation coming forward. It will convince China that maybe the correlation of forces doesn't inevitably favor China, that they're going to have to deal with a US competitor over the long term. And I think both countries will decide that they need to find a way to coexist, because each government has made pledges to its people. China wants to realize the China dream, wants to become a mature, developed country. President Biden has talked about wanting to address the grievances of the middle class. If China and the United States have a across-the-board confrontation, neither regime is going to meet its pledges for its people. So on balance, at the end of the day, if we take care of our knitting, strengthen ourselves, I think we can find a way to an outcome that is peaceful and prosperous and can actually benefit both countries. But there's a lot of lifting that needs to be done to get there.
A lot of lifting and over a very long term. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky and Stephen Hadley for all of your insights and the willingness to engage in this discussion. And on behalf of the Chamber and everyone who's listening, thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the program.